This episode is brought to you by Roon. Click the link in the description box below for more information.
Good morning. Good morning. These speakers say good morning, don't they? They really do. They are the Kaya S12 from Audio. I'm not talking about them today, but they really do pop in Technicolor. They really do leap at you visually. An album that leaps at you sonically is this one from Atom TM called HD or HD. This for me is probably one of the best sounding electronic music albums ever made. And it's somewhat close to Kraftwerk stuff, a couple of tracks are. The track to play initially is the first one, Pop HD or Pop HD, because it really does pop. It pops out of the speakers as much as the speakers like these pop at you visually. Powering these speakers is the Lyngdorf TDAI-1120. What a name. I'm just going to call it the Lyngdorf moving forwards. It's a little shoebox amp. It's a streaming amplifier. That means we get Spotify Connect, AirPlay 2, Roon Readiness, and Chromecast. So in many ways, functionally and size-wise, it's very close to amps we've looked at quite recently, like the Audio EVO 150 and the Naim Uniti Atom. And I know many people want to know how this little Lyngdorf amp compares to those two British shoebox streaming amplifiers. Obviously, the first major difference is that on the Lyngdorf, there is no screen on the front telling you, what's playing now. There's no menu system to navigate on there. There's no cover art. It's a much more sort of understated looking piece, but we'll come back to that because really I think people want to know, how does this compare to the Cambridge and the Naim sound-wise? Now, when this Lyngdorf amp arrived, I was in the middle of assessing the Sonus Faber Lumina 2 loudspeakers that we made a video about recently. And I swapped out the Cambridge for the Lyngdorf when it arrived just to see how it would sound, really. I was just curious. And to my amazement and a little bit of frustration is that I don't think this Lyngdorf amp works very well with those Sonus Fabers. And I don't know why. And what I mean by they didn't work very well was that the whole sound came off as a bit dynamically constrained. But the Cambridge audio, totally fine with the Sonus Fabers, as is the Naim. So that was just a little bit puzzling for me right out of the gate. But I had no problems with the KEF LS50 Meta. The Lyngdorf with those seemed to be a really good fit. There was good dynamics, a good sense of scale. Not quite the sense of scale, sort of soundstage width and height wise, as the Cambridge Audio EVO 150. Not quite, small difference, but not night and day. And there isn't not quite the body, the sort of acoustic mass, the sort of meat on bone from the Lyngdorf with the LS50 Meta as we get from the Naim or the Cambridge. But again, the delta is small, but I have to call it out. And the thing is, that means that the Lyngdorf isn't necessarily the best fit for very thin sounding 80s indie albums like the Pale Saints' debut. But where the Lyngdorf really excels is with a sense of speed and a sense of musical purity. No, I'm not saying it's musical, and I'm not saying there is abundant musicality. I'm talking about the purity of sound. It sounds like like if it were a juicer, it would just be getting more of that juice out of the fruit. I think that's a very bad analogy, but that's what I'm hearing. And in many ways, it reminds me of the gain card amplifier from 47 Labs. That's very niche. Many of you might not know what that is, but also the gain clone amplifiers that followed it. They also all had that sort of sense of musical purity, even if they didn't have the scale or the muscularity of other amplifiers. Now, could that be because this Lyngdorf is, unlike the Naim, unlike the Cambridge, it's an all digital amplifier. Now, all digital does not mean it's Class D. The Cambridge is Class D, the Lyngdorf is all digital. Now, what that means is that the digital signal arrives at the amplifier, travels all the way through, there's no DAC in the middle, goes all the way to just before the output stage, and then the PCM signal is converted into what's called PWM. I'll put a link below about this. And then that PWM is used to drive the output stage of the amplifier. Whereas if we contrast that with the Cambridge, the signal comes in and it is then converted to analog, and then analog moves the signal forward a bit, and then there is like a delta sigma type comparator, I'm a bit hazy on this actually, which then is used to switch the output stage on the amp. So basically in the Cambridge there is an interceding analog stage, and there's not with the Lyngdorf. On paper, the TDAI-1120, I said I wouldn't say it again, but I did. It gives us 60 watts per channel into 8 ohms. That is 20 watts per channel more than the Naim. But side by side, it doesn't sound like it. For me, the Naim sounds like the more dynamically punchy and I guess just more powerful amplifier. It just feels like it has more in reserve. And we can certainly see that with the headroom on the Lyngdorf. Like I get closer to full volume on it than I do on, say, the Cambridge or the Naim. So that's a gain thing, not necessarily a power thing. And one more thing about how the Lyngdorf compares to the Naim, it doesn't sound as muscular or as groove laden as the Naim. Again, small differences. These are not big differences. I'm just amplifying them to let you know, how these amplifiers differ in their sort of audible presentation. So if we think of these three amplifiers' audible profiles as analogous to TVs, the Darko.Audio Evo 150 might be a large LCD panel. The Naim might be a slightly smaller CRT TV, the big old chunky ones. Whereas the Lyngdorf is a slightly smaller panel again, but it's OLED. Its image is, it offers this sort of purity. We seem to kind of get more from it in terms of music's essence. God, I think I really just disappeared up my own arse there, didn't I? Oh well. But that isn't the end of the story. That's actually the beginning of the story, because the Lyngdorf has so much more to offer us. It's not as showy in the looks department as the Cambridge or the Naim. And for me, it recalls some of the Braun gear, or Brown, I don't know how you say that. Brown, Olaf? Braun? Brown, thank you. Some of that gear from the 50s and 60s, that sort of old school aesthetic. So you've just got one volume control, a source selector switch, and a very discreet on-off button. I really like that. And the menu display, such as it is, can seem a little bit crazy, but when you start rotating that source selection switch, it kind of all makes sense. So it's very, very understated. And it's also Kallax-Fi, like the Naim, like the Cambridge. That means it fits into one of the holes in a Kallax unit. For some people, that's very important. On hardwired inputs, we get a couple of Toslink inputs, a couple of coaxial, we get HDMI ARC, and we have one analog and an phono stage to boot, which I think is great. Control comes from Lyngdorf's remote smartphone app, but the advanced features are accessible through a web interface, which means we can run it on pretty much any device. I think that's fantastic. And that web interface is clean, it's simple to understand, and it's very fast. Instead of an infrared remote control in the box, that's an 80 euro optional extra. If you want it, you can buy it. If you don't, I don't need it. But anyway, instead of that in the box, we get a microphone, a good one as well. And we also get a microphone stand. And those two things point to why I think the Lyngdorf is a better long-term proposition for many people, but not everybody, than the Naim or the Cambridge. So at the heart of this amplifier is a DSP engine. And right out of the gate, as soon as you fire the app up, you can see that you have different voicing options, like music or bass. Now these are subtle. And if you dig deeper into the web interface, you can see the graph that's being applied to your sound. Now I like the music voicing, but when I go and look at the graph, it looks quite dramatic because it pulls 3 kilohertz down 3 dB and you go, my God, there's a huge hole in the sound. But when you come to listen to it, it's super subtle. So I think for me, that was a lesson in not being alarmed or shocked or worried just because there's a slight dip in the frequency response. Many people get very hung up on, flat, but I'm not. And I just, there's about 20 of these different voicings and they all have different graphs, and you can dig around, you can customize them if you want. You can create your own voicings if you want. So that is really where this sort of DSP customization starts. But it goes much further because this amplifier's biggest selling point is something called Room Perfect. And this is Peter Lyngdorf's room correction software / algorithm / process. And it isn't just room correction because it also takes care of subwoofer integration. So it treats the mains, so the orange speakers, and the sub, in my case the KEF KC62, which is on the floor behind me. It treats them all as one system and then applies correction to that. And the whole process, we can do the whole room correction process in about 30 minutes. It's super simple. I think even my mum and dad could do it, actually. It really is. I mean, the web interface that we have to use to do it is a bit plain. But if you read it carefully, it's not overwhelming. It walks you through step by step in a wizard-like fashion. So it's super user-friendly. Now I've run Room Perfect on these speakers and the sub behind me. I've done it with the Zoos and the KEF sub. I've done it with the LS50 Meta and the KEF sub, all of which netted excellent results. Let me tell you why I'm enthusiastic about this kind of setup. Basically, it means that the Lyngdorf amp low pass filters our sub. It chooses 80 Hertz as its sort of default, but you can change it if you're a power user and you know what you're doing. But corresponding to that, we also have an 80 Hertz high pass filter applied to our mains. Now, why is this advantageous? Well, that is really because now the mains are sort of being rolled off at 80 Hertz. So in the case of, for example, the KEF LS50 Meta, they would normally sort of naturally roll off maybe just below 50. But we're telling them to roll off 80. So that means we're not asking the mains to do any low bass because that's being taken care of by the sub. And the upshot is that the Lyngdorf amp's 60 watts per channel output rating now matters much less because it's not being asked to drive the LS50 into the sort of lower bass regions. It only has to take care of 80 Hertz and above. And it's the same with the Zoo, and it's the same with these Vivid Audio speakers here. One major difference to Dirac, is that we don't need a computer connected to the back of the amp to run the room measurement process. Besides, there's no USB connection on the back of the Lyngdorf. What we do is we connect the XLR socket of the microphone into the back of the Lyngdorf, and then the wizard on the web interface walks us step by step through the whole process. And that wizard can be run on a phone or a laptop. And we don't even need to be in the same room while we're doing it. What I did is I took my laptop into the kitchen and then ran the wizard, and it just asked me to come into the lounge, move the microphone position, and then I went back into the kitchen and pressed go, and then all these kind of crazy weird sounds came out of the speakers. And then when it finished that, after about, I don't know, 30 seconds, it would ask me to move the microphone again. So I'd come back in here, move it again, go back to the kitchen, another go. And it would build a sort of computational map of what my room is like. Also, what the speakers are like as well. I think Room Perfect, one of its key features, according to the manufacturer, is it maintains the characteristics of your loudspeakers. Now, I can definitely say that by doing Room Perfect on a whole bunch of different loudspeakers with the sub, they all still sounded different. So when I did it with the zoos still sounded like zoos. It didn't make all of the three systems sound alike. I don't think it's possible to EQ one speaker to sound like another anyway. But I think it's interesting that the sound of your speaker is maintained. I think that's very important, especially if you've spent a long time choosing your loudspeaker. Now, Room Perfect, usually asks us to take about 5, 6, 7 measurements, and we can stop when its room knowledge gets to 95%. I usually do an extra one to kind of bump it up to 96 or 97. Another direct difference is that with Room Perfect, we don't get to see or edit the room compensation curve. It's all sort of hidden from view. But that does not mean that we cannot tweak the results, because there is plenty in the advanced settings to keep the power user who knows what he or she is doing busy. For example, to improve Room Perfect's accuracy, we can, if we want to, measure the distance from the ear to the loudspeaker, the ear to the other loudspeaker, the ear to the sub, and then plug those differences into the Room Perfect web interface. I didn't do that. But what I did do was, for my own personal satisfaction, I took the sub gain down by about 2 dB, because to me that sounded better. I don't like big bass. I don't know why, I just don't. But also, that's the thing, isn't it? You get to decide what works for you. There isn't like a prescriptive way of going about Room Perfect. I mean, yes, it gives you a starting point, and then you can tweak it from there. I also delayed the mains output by 2 milliseconds. And it's great because you can, when you punch in a number into the web interface, it automatically adjusts the setting on the fly. You don't need to click save or apply or anything like that. So I tried different delay levels, and 2 milliseconds for me is where the whole sort of bass and main sort of locked into place. And I was using this album to test for that. Maurizio's M series album. This is dub techno from the early to late 90s. This compilation of releases or edits came out in the mid-noughties. This is basically an alternative to Basic Channel. It's the same guys, Moritz van Oswald and Mark Anestis. And for me, this is just brilliant for testing for bass integration with the mains. Yeah, I think it's fantastic. I love it. It's a great album anyway, but it's just really, it's my go-to for testing subwoofer integration. Let's remind ourselves of the order of priorities of hardware when setting up a music listening system at home with 2 channels, so basically left and right loudspeakers. Firstly, the most important thing is the room. That will impact the sound the most. Then the speakers, then the sub, then the amplifier, then the DAC, then the streamer. So room speakers sub, for me, have become more important than worrying about the DAC or the streamer further up the chain. And that for me is why I would pick the Lyngdorf over the Cambridge and the Naim in the long term, because I want to integrate subwoofers more often. I don't always want to do that because obviously I can't review speakers with a sub in the signal path, but for my own sort of personal satisfaction, I do want to be able to do that. I want to have it corrected for the room, but most of all, I want it to be an easy, quick process. And it is with Room Perfect. So we might not get a nice color display showing cover art on the front of this Lyngdorf amp. But for me, that's a minor concession when we factor in room correction, subwoofer integration. And let us not forget that the Lyngdorf sells for €2,000. That's a full €1,000 cheaper than the Naim and 500 cheaper than the Darko.Audio 150. But it's not all about me, is it? It's about you as well. So if you're weighing up the Cambridge, the Naim and the Lyngdorf, then you should ask yourself, do you have a difficult room? And are you integrating subwoofers? Because if the answer is yes to one or both of those, then I think the Lyngdorf should be your pick of the three. Because I think adding a sub and correcting for your room is more important than fussing about the sound quality of your DAC or the sound quality of your streamer. So if you like this video, please hit the like button down below. If you like my attitude towards high-end audio, hi-fi gear that is now encompassing subwoofers in a more prominent way than maybe I was using a couple of years ago, because I'm allowed to change, right? I am allowed to evolve in my coverage. So if you dig that, then please subscribe to this channel. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.